This episode's a continuation of Comparators Part 1 and focuses on comparison and subtraction. Watch Part 1 to learn about measurement, power stabilization, and item sorters. Hi, I'm MistRazor, and welcome back to Redstone from Zero, a series where I teach you Redstone from its foundations, assuming you come in knowing absolutely nothing about it. As always, I recommend that newcomers start at episode 0, but I'll do my best to be comprehensible, even if you haven't. With that out of the way, let's talk about comparison and subtraction. Right-clicking a comparator toggles it between comparison mode and subtraction mode. If the output light is off, it's in comparison mode. If the output light is on, it's in subtraction mode. The difference between the two modes is that, well, comparison mode compares and subtraction mode subtracts. Since that's not a very useful explanation, let's go in a little more depth. A comparator in compare mode is like one of those "you must be at least this tall to ride this ride" signs at a theme park, where they check your height and either stop you or let you through. A comparator in compare mode either blocks the redstone signal entirely or lets it through unchanged. A comparator in subtract mode is like the ticket counter or admissions gate. You pay a certain amount to get through. If you have enough money, or in our case, redstone signal strength, you get through, but you have to spend the required amount, so you have less when you come out the other end. A comparator has one main input and output, the eyes and mouth we talked about in part 1, and on each of its other two sides it has a secondary input. These secondary inputs are what set the minimum allowed amount for compared mode, or the cost of admission for subtract mode. The only blocks that work as secondary inputs are redstone dust, repeaters, comparators, observers, and redstone blocks, but redstone blocks only work in Java Edition. By the way, when using these secondary inputs, the comparator will always use the stronger of the two signals. That is, if you have a left side input of 3 and a right side input of 8, the comparator will use the 8 and completely ignore the 3. So let's go through some concrete examples of comparison and subtraction. Let's say we have a comparator in compare mode, with a primary input of 13 and a secondary input of 8. In that case, 13 is checked against the required minimum of 8, and it's found to meet the minimum, so the output of the comparator is 13. Now let's decrease the input from 13 to 8. Now 8 is checked against the required minimum of 8, and it's found to meet the minimum, so the output of the comparator is 8. Now let's decrease the input again from 8 to 5. Now 5 is checked against the required minimum of 8, but it's not sufficient, so in that case the output of the comparator is 0. The same things happen if you raise or lower the secondary input rather than the primary input. The output in compare mode is always either the primary input value or 0. The secondary input is just used to decide which of those it is. Now let's switch to subtract mode. The primary input is still 5, and the secondary input is still 8. Now we're subtracting 8 from 5. Since we can't have negative redstone power levels, the output is 0. Then let's increase the primary input to 8 again. The secondary input is still also 8, so we're subtracting 8 from 8, which gives an output of 0. Finally, let's increase the primary input back to 13. Now we're subtracting 8 from 13, so the output will be 5. Something to note about subtract mode is that the actual values don't really matter, only their power levels relative to each other. That is, inputs of 5 and 0 give the same output as 7 and 2, 10 and 5, or 15 and 10. And I'll let you in on a little secret. When I said we weren't going to be using compare mode or subtract mode back in part 1, I was lying. Because the fact is, a comparator is always doing either comparison or subtraction. It's just that if you don't connect anything to the sides of the comparator, the secondary input value is 0. Meaning the output of a comparator with no side inputs is always the same as its input, which you'll remember from part 1. And this means that you can use a single comparator to measure and compare, or measure and subtract at the same time. And in fact, if we look at my Redstone component factory from High World Season 2, you'll see that I do exactly that. I measure each hopper with a comparator and compare that value against 15, using the lectern trick. In essence, what this setup is saying is, only output a redstone signal when the hopper is completely full, or more specifically to this application, craft once whenever the hopper is completely full. So that's it when it comes to the actual mechanics of the comparator. It's one of those easy to learn, difficult to master types of components, because it has so many applications. And on that note, let's talk about what useful circuits we can build with comparators in compare mode or subtract mode. The first thing we can do is update the pulse extender from part 1 to give even more control over pulse length. All we have to do is put the comparators in the pulse extender into subtract mode, and then add a secondary input of the amount we want the signal to decay for every lap around the circuit. Before, we could have it decay by either 1 or 2 per lap, depending on whether we replaced one of the redstone dust with a strongly powered block. But now, we can make it decay as much as we want each lap. You could even make the decay per lap change based on some other factor, by using that factor to control the side input power level. Although, I can't say I've ever used a variable decay pulse extender before. We can also make a new type of clock, using a comparator in subtract mode. All you have to do is put the comparator in subtract mode, then connect its output to one of its side inputs, like this, and then power the comparator's primary input. Despite being a clock, don't be fooled. Even though the comparator output may appear to, it doesn't actually go all the way down to 0. I'll use /tick freeze to stop time and show you. See? It oscillates between 15 and 2. So if you need it to oscillate between 0 and 15, you'll just need to take an output by attaching a repeater to the same redstone that serves as the comparator's secondary input. Or if you're fine with an oscillation between 0 and 13, you can just use that redstone dust directly. Here's how the clock works. The dust starts out unpowered, so the comparator outputs the same signal strength as its input. Let's say the input is from a redstone block, so it's power level 15. And because there are 3 redstone dust connecting the output to the side input, that signal strength decays from 15 to 14 to 13, which serves as the next secondary input to the comparator. Since the comparator is in subtract mode, it subtracts 13 from the input value of 15, and the next output of the comparator is 2. The signal strength decays from 2 to 1 to 0, which serves as the next secondary input to the comparator. The comparator subtracts 0 from 15, so the next output of the comparator is 15 again, and it oscillates back and forth between 15 and 2 every redstone tick. One thing to remember though, since I've seen this trip people up in the past, is that the subtraction only affects the output of the comparator, not the input. Going back to the ticket counter analogy, the person in the front of the line gives money to go past the ticket counter, but the people behind them in line haven't paid yet. So if we have a line of people that each have $15, they only pay their admission fee, let's say $3, as they pass the counter. Meaning everyone in line before the ticket counter has $15, and everyone past the ticket counter has $12. Even in the case where the output gets looped back around to serve as the secondary input, that only means that the price of admission keeps changing. It doesn't change how much money each person in line still has. Something else we can build with a comparator in subtract mode is a torch selector. How this works is that we have a redstone line with redstone torches attached to the opaque building blocks that hold the dust. And we set up the redstone line so that at any given time, exactly 1 dust in the redstone line has a power level of 0. Meaning exactly 1 building block at a time is unpowered. And because torches are inverters, only 1 building block being unpowered at a time means only 1 torch at a time will be powered. The torch attached to the block that's holding the unpowered redstone dust. This allows us to control which torch is powered by turning the pages of a book on a lectern, for example. How we get to where we only have 1 unpowered block at a time is by powering the redstone line from both ends. Let's call them A and B. We power end A with the output from a comparator reading from the block we want to use to control the torch selector, in this case a lectern with a book. We power end B by subtracting the same signal strength A uses from 15. Here we do that by having a comparator in subtract mode reading from a redstone torch, using the same power level as A as its secondary input. So if the book is on its last page, giving A a power level of 15, B will have a power level of 0. And if we remove the book from the lectern to give A a power level of 0, B will have a power level of 15. In short, A and B always add up to 15, because however much power we add to A will at the same time be subtracted from B. Consider for a moment that the power level from A directly determines how many blocks the redstone power will travel from A before decaying to 0, and that the same is true of B. So if A has a power level of 5, it will power 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 blocks. And then B will have a power level of 10, because 5 plus 10 equals 15, and will power 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 10 blocks. Together, that's 15 blocks total that are powered. So as long as we make sure the redstone line is exactly 16 blocks long, this setup ensures exactly 15 of those blocks at a time will be powered, meaning exactly 1 block at a time will be unpowered, which gives us our desired result of exactly 1 torch at a time being powered. We can do the same thing with an item frame, but instead of inputs going up to 15, it will only go up to 8, since comparators max out at 8 when reading from item frames. It's more compact, but exactly the same principles are at play. Another useful circuit we can create is an item counter. Well, it doesn't exactly count items, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. To understand how this works, you need to know a little bit about droppers. I'll go over them in more detail in a later video, but for now you just need to know that droppers only activate on the rising edge of a redstone pulse, when the power goes from off to on, and that upon activation, a dropper will either try to push one item into the inventory of the block it's pointing into, much like a hopper does, or it will eject one item if the dropper is not pointing at a block with an inventory. How it works is the comparator reads from the dropper, and if there's at least one item inside, the comparator outputs at least a power level of 1. The repeater boosts that up to 15, and the powered redstone line powers the dropper, making it eject one item. At the same time, the redstone power level has dropped down to 12 by the time the redstone dust loops back around to be the comparator's secondary input, making the comparator, which is in compare mode, now block all redstone signals with less than 12 strength. So as long as there's less than 7 stacks and 5 items in the dropper, that is, a comparator output of 12, the comparator blocks output because the input value is less than 12. Since the comparator's output is now 0, the repeater propagates that 0 forward, which lowers the comparator's secondary input to 0 as well. Once the secondary input has dropped to 0, there's nothing to stop the comparator from outputting again. So this cycle continues until the dropper has ejected its entire contents. This may seem pointless to you, but this circuit does something very useful. It pulses once for every item in the dropper. And even more usefully, by controlling how long it takes for the comparator plus repeater output to get back to the comparator as a secondary input, which cuts off the signal, we can eject the dropper contents as quickly or as slowly as we want. But I'm guessing it won't become apparent just how useful that is until I show you this video's cool thing that you can build. So let's jump into that. Here, this is an item vending machine. You rotate the torch in the item frame to choose an item, then put in some diamonds and it'll spit out your purchase. For the sake of simplicity, it's 1 diamond per item, which is ludicrously expensive considering we're selling glazed terracotta. But the nice thing about this vending machine is that you can just dump in however many diamonds you want and it will always give you the correct amount of glazed terracotta. And let's take a peek at the redstone. See, it's so simple I don't even need to explain it. Just kidding. We're probably having another "Mist, you've lost the plot" moment, right? But just like in the Observer's video, you already know everything you need in order to build this. We'll go through it step by step. To start with, there are 3 main actions we need to perform in order to have a working vending machine. First, we need to allow the customer to select their desired item. Second, we need to accept payment in diamonds. And third, we need to vend the correct number of items depending on how many diamonds were inserted. Okay, now let's remove the casing and color code the different parts that make up this vending machine. We'll start with the green section. It has some droppers pointing down over a water stream, which carries any ejected items to the customer. The droppers are activated using a torch selector, so the item to be vended is chosen by how the torch is rotated in the item frame. As you might already be able to see, this section as it exists now suffers from 2 major problems. The first is that choosing an item automatically vends one of that item, even if no payment has been inserted. And even worse, it vends one of each item you have to rotate past to get to the item you want. The second is that it can only vend one of the item you've chosen, because the torch that activates the correct dropper stays on constantly, preventing the dropper from receiving the multiple rising edges it needs in order to vend multiple items. To solve this problem, we can add the red section. The red section is a redstone torch tower that ends with its top torch in the middle of the torch selector, powering all of its redstone dust. It'll force all the torch selector's torches to turn off, even the one that would normally be turned on, meaning that the chosen torch selector torch will become powered whenever the middle redstone torch is depowered, and that will activate the corresponding dropper and eject an item. This allows us to change which item is selected without unintentionally vending any items in the process. And whenever we power the base of the red section, it will flip the power state of all blocks in the tower, turning off the top torch and vending an item. This allows us to vend multiple of the same item in a row by pulsing the base of the red section multiple times. So now we've solved the 2 problems we started with, but our solution introduced a new problem. Now we can't see which torch in the torch selector is currently selected, because that torch will only turn on when the red section's top torch has been depowered. To solve that problem, we'll add the yellow section. The yellow section is another torch selector that turns on the redstone lamp that corresponds to the currently selected item. The only difference between this torch selector and the ones we've seen before is that ends A and B are further apart, so we use a line of comparators to bring the correct redstone power level to end B without raising or lowering it. So now we can select the item we want to vend, We can see what our selection is, and we can vend as many items as we want by pulsing the base of the red section's torch tower. That means that of our required vending machine actions, we've checked off one completely. We display the selected item and allow the customer to change it. And we've partially checked off number 3. We can vend any number of items we want. We just need to pulse the red section's torch tower that many times. So what we have left to do is all of number 2 and part of number 3. We need to accept payment in diamonds and then pulse the redstone torch tower once for each diamond inserted, which will vend the correct number of items to the customer. So the next thing we need to do is attach an item filter to the payment barrel, which will accept diamonds and leave anything else in the barrel. This is the purple section. It takes in diamonds and pushes them into the collection barrel using a standard impulse sorter. That takes care of requirement 2, meaning we just have to take care of the last part of requirement 3, pulsing the red section's torch tower the correct number of times, once per diamond inserted. We'll use the pink section to do that, using a modified version of the item counter we showed earlier. We have the dropper and hopper pointing into each other, which means that whenever the item counter pulses, it will push one smooth stone back into the hopper rather than ejecting it onto the ground. We start with a hopper full of 5 stacks of smooth stone, positioned next to the purple section's redstone torch, which ensures it will lock and unlock at the same time as the purple section's lower hopper, meaning the number of smooth stone the hopper pushes into the dropper will be equal to the number of diamonds that pass through the item filter, which means the pink section will pulse once for each diamond inserted. So we're done. Well, almost. There's one new problem we've introduced. If the customer inserts more than 5 stacks of diamonds at a time, the smooth stone item counter might not count all the diamonds. So we'll add the light blue section to temporarily lock the top hopper of the item filter whenever the pink section's hopper is empty. It does that by using a redstone torch to invert the comparator output value, which means the torch will only be on when the comparator output is 0. That is, when the hopper it's looking at is empty. When the torch is powered, it powers the redstone dust diagonally up from it, locking the purple section's upper hopper, which prevents any more diamonds from being accepted until there's some smooth stone in the hopper to count them. And now we're actually done. So let's take the vending machine for a spin. We'll select, let's say, lime glazed terracotta, why not? And we'll do 12 of them. 12 diamonds, there we go. And there we go. 12 lime glazed terracotta, just what we wanted. Now, I wouldn't recommend using this design on an SMP server, simply because it doesn't detect when items are out of stock. But other than that, it's pretty solid, and its design is simple for what it does. I intentionally designed it without compacting the redstone, because I wanted you to be able to see the different sections as cleanly divided as I could make them. Another thing I like about this design is that it showcases all 4 functions of a comparator. The purple, pink, and light blue sections showcase measurement, and 3 things you can do with it. Purple lets the measurement control how far down a redstone line is powered. Pink raises the power level to 15 if it detects any non-zero output at all, and light blue inverts the output, resulting in a container emptiness detector. The yellow section showcases power stabilization in the rear line of comparators, carrying the correct power level all the way to the secondary input of the subtract mode comparator. The yellow and green sections showcase subtraction in the comparators reading from their lecterns, ensuring only one redstone dust at a time will be unpowered. The pink section showcases comparison, by using the raised power level of the repeater output to cut off the comparator's signal shortly after it begins, creating the pulse that both pushes the smooth stone back into the hopper and depowers the red section top torch, resulting in ejecting a glazed terracotta for the customer. So give building your own vending machine a try. For an added challenge, try adding an out-of-stock light for each item. You can look at the light blue section for a hint on how you could do that. Alright, before we end, let's review what we talked about today. 1. When you have 2 secondary inputs, a comparator will always use the stronger one and ignore the weaker one. Only redstone dust, repeaters, comparators, observers, and Java only, redstone blocks, work as secondary inputs. 2. Right-clicking a comparator toggles it between compare mode and subtract mode. When the output light is on, that means it's in subtract mode. 3. Compare mode stops the signal entirely if the primary input power level is less than the secondary input power level. Otherwise, it lets it proceed unchanged. 4. Subtract mode always outputs the primary input power level minus the secondary input power level. But since there are no power levels lower than 0, Any subtraction that would result in negative signal strength will instead just give an output of 0. 5. Subtraction, even self-subtraction, only affects the output of a comparator, not the input. 6. You can measure and compare at the same time. You can also measure and subtract at the same time. This will be useful later when we start talking about the crafter specifically. As always, if you have questions or if something was confusing, leave a comment and I'll do my best to explain things to you. If you enjoyed this episode and think it deserves a like, I greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe as well. It helps out the channel a lot. With that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!